Sometimes the most expensive mistake a city can make lasts less than 10 minutes. That's what people would later say about a quiet Tuesday morning in downtown Baltimore. A morning that began like any other with commuters rushing across crosswalks, delivery trucks humming along the curb, and the familiar scent of roasted coffee drifting through the cool air outside a small corner cafe on Market Street. Inside that cafe, the line moved slowly but peacefully, the kind of routine moment people barely notice while it's happening. Angela Carter stood halfway down the line holding her phone and glancing occasionally toward the register, dressed simply in a navy blazer and dark slacks, looking like any other professional grabbing coffee before work. No one paid her special attention. She wasn't loud, she wasn't impatient, and she didn't seem in a hurry. She simply waited. The barista called out orders one by one. Steam rose from the espresso machine, and outside the glass windows the city rolled into its usual rhythm. Angela had done this hundreds of times before. A quick stop, one latte, then straight to the office. But that morning something shifted the moment the door opened again and a uniformed officer stepped inside. Officer Daniel Brooks was known around the district for his confidence and his sharp tone. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of walk that made people move aside without thinking, he scanned the cafe the way some officers do when they enter a room, slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something out of place. His eyes moved past the tables, past the register, past the people chatting quietly with their phones and laptops. Then they stopped. On Angela. It wasn't clear why at first. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was bias. Maybe it was simply a moment that would later be replayed thousands of times online by people trying to understand how something so small became something so costly. Brooks took a few steps closer, his boots echoing faintly on the cafe floor. Conversations lowered. A few people glanced up. Angela noticed him too, but she didn't react the way many people might when confronted by a uniform. She didn't panic. She didn't argue. She simply turned her head slightly and met his eyes with calm patience. "Ma'am," Brooks said, his voice firm but loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "I need to ask you a few questions." The line stopped moving. Someone behind Angela shifted uncomfortably. The barista paused mid-order. Angela looked around briefly, almost as if confirming the question was meant for her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly. Brooks crossed his arms and studied her for a second longer than necessary. "Just routine," he replied. "Mind showing some identification?" A quiet tension settled over the room, the kind that spreads when strangers realize something awkward is unfolding in front of them. Angela slowly reached into her purse, but then stopped. She looked back up at him, thoughtful, measured. "Officer," she said gently, "I'm just here to buy coffee." Brooks didn't smile. Then it shouldn't be difficult to cooperate. A customer near the window pulled out a phone. Another leaned slightly closer, pretending to stir their drink while listening. Angela took a slow breath, the same kind of breath someone takes when they've already decided not to escalate a situation. "Are you certain you want to do this?" she asked quietly. The question sounded simple, but something about the way she said it made the room feel heavier. Brooks let out a short laugh under his breath. "Ma'am, I asked for ID." Angela held his gaze for a long moment. Around them the cafe had gone nearly silent except for the low hiss of the espresso machine. Outside, traffic continued to pass, unaware that within the next half hour this quiet coffee shop would become the center of a viral video, an internal investigation, and eventually a legal settlement that would send shockwaves through City Hall. Because at that moment, standing in line with a latte order waiting to be called, the woman Officer Brooks had decided to detain wasn't just another customer on Market Street. She was Angela Carter, and she supervised an entire division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Angela Carter did not reach for her identification immediately. Instead, she studied Officer Daniel Brooks with the calm attention of someone who had spent years reading rooms, reading faces, and recognizing when a situation was about to become something bigger than it appeared. Around them, the small cafe had fallen into a strange quiet. A man in a business suit lowered his newspaper slowly. Two college students near the window exchanged glances. The barista behind the counter pretended to wipe the same section of the espresso machine for the third time while carefully watching what was happening. Officer Brooks shifted his weight and spoke again, his tone sharper now, as if patience was something he did not intend to extend for long. "Identification, ma'am," he repeated. Angela nodded slightly as if she understood the request perfectly well. She placed her purse gently on the counter beside her and rested one hand on the strap without opening it yet. Her movements were deliberate, measured, almost slow enough to make people wonder whether she was thinking several steps ahead. "Officer Brooks," she said calmly, glancing briefly at the name on his badge, "may I ask what exactly you believe I have done?" The officer frowned slightly. The fact that she had read his name seemed to irritate him more than it should have. "Suspicious behavior," he replied quickly. "You have been standing here watching the room." A quiet murmur moved through the café. Someone near the door let out a soft, incredulous breath. Angela tilted her head slightly, considering his words with a patience that seemed almost impossible in that moment. "I have been waiting in line for coffee," she answered gently. Brooks took one step closer. His presence now filled the small space between them. "Then show your identification, and we will clear it up." Angela's eyes moved briefly toward the glass window where sunlight reflected off the passing traffic outside. The morning still looked ordinary out there. Cars moved through the intersection. A cyclist passed the corner. Life continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Inside the cafe, however, time felt slower. Angela finally opened her purse and looked inside, but she did not remove anything yet. Instead, she looked back up at Brooks with the same calm expression she had maintained from the beginning. "Officer," she said quietly, "I want you to listen carefully to what I am about to say." The officer folded his arms again. "Go ahead." Angela paused, just long enough for the silence in the room to deepen. "You are about to turn a routine morning into something far more complicated than it needs to be." Brooks shook his head with a short laugh that carried a hint of disbelief. "Complicated for who?" Angela did not answer immediately. A customer near the window lifted a phone slightly higher, pretending to read a message while recording the scene. Angela's gaze returned to the officer. "For you," she said calmly. Brooks exhaled through his nose as if the conversation had already gone on longer than it deserved. "Ma'am, if you refuse to cooperate, I can detain you until we confirm your identity." Angela nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement as if it were part of a script she had heard many times before in different places and under different circumstances. "You believe that is the correct decision?" she asked. Brooks did not hesitate. "Yes." Angela closed her purse gently and rested both hands on the counter. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Outside, a black sport utility vehicle rolled past the cafe window and continued down the street. No one inside noticed it yet. Angela Carter looked directly into the officer's eyes and spoke with quiet clarity. "Then I would suggest you prepare for what happens next." The words were not loud. They were not threatening. They carried no anger. Yet the way she said them made several people in the cafe exchange uncertain glances. Officer Brooks, however, did not notice their reactions. He was focused entirely on the woman in front of him, convinced that he was controlling the situation unfolding in the middle of the cafe. What he did not realize was that the moment had already passed the point where control belonged to him. Because 3 blocks away, inside a federal office building overlooking the harbor, a team of investigators had already started wondering why their supervisor had not arrived for a scheduled morning briefing that she had never missed in 6 years. Officer Daniel Brooks believed the moment was still his to control. From where he stood, the situation seemed simple, almost routine. A suspicious customer refusing to cooperate. A quick detention. A few questions. Then paperwork and the rest of his shift. That was how mornings like this usually ended. What he did not notice was how the energy in the cafe had quietly shifted. Customers were no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. The room had entered that strange suspended state where strangers silently agree they are witnessing something that will not remain small for long. Angela Carter stood exactly where she had been the entire time, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that unsettled people who expected fear or frustration. Instead of reacting emotionally, she simply watched Officer Brooks as if she were evaluating a decision he had already made. "Ma'am," Brooks said again, his voice firm and official, "if you do not present identification, I will need you to step outside while we verify your identity." The barista behind the counter froze with a cup halfway to the espresso machine. A man near the door whispered something to the person beside him. Angela glanced briefly toward the window again. The sunlight had grown brighter on Market Street. Cars passed in steady lines, horns sounding faintly through the glass. The outside world looked completely normal. Inside the cafe, the silence deepened. Angela slowly turned her attention back to Brooks. "Officer," she said carefully, "I have already advised you that you are making a mistake." Brooks gave a short, dismissive shake of his head. "And I have already advised you that refusing to cooperate will make things more difficult." Angela held his gaze for a long moment. There was no anger in her eyes. No panic. Only a quiet certainty that made several people in the room feel uneasy without knowing why. Finally, she reached into her purse again. For a brief second, Brooks appeared satisfied, as if the moment had finally resolved itself in the predictable direction he expected. But Angela did not remove a wallet or a driver license. Instead, she took out her phone and placed it gently on the counter in front of her. The screen lit up. Brooks frowned. "I asked for identification," he said. "And you will have it," Angela replied calmly. She tapped the screen once, sending a short message. The movement was small, almost insignificant. Yet something about the deliberate way she did it made Brooks narrow his eyes. "Who are you contacting?" he asked. Angela did not answer immediately. She simply locked the phone again and rested her hand beside it. Around them, the quiet tension continued to grow. Outside the cafe window, a dark government sport utility vehicle turned slowly onto Market Street and came to a stop near the curb. Most of the people inside did not notice it yet. Angela Carter did. Her eyes moved briefly toward the vehicle and then back to Officer Brooks. "Officer Brooks," she said in a steady voice that carried clearly through the room, "I am going to give you one more opportunity to reconsider what you are doing." Brooks crossed his arms again. "That is not how this works." Angela tilted her head slightly, almost curious about his confidence. "You believe that?" she asked softly. Brooks nodded. "I enforce the law here." Angela took a slow breath, the same calm breath she had taken earlier. "No," she said quietly. "You enforce your understanding of it." Brooks was about to respond when the cafe door opened behind him. The bell above the entrance rang once, sharp and clear in the silent room. Two men stepped inside wearing dark suits and carrying the unmistakable posture of federal agents who were accustomed to moving through crowded spaces without asking permission. One of them scanned the room quickly until his eyes landed on Angela Carter, standing beside the counter. His expression changed instantly from alert focus to controlled concern. He stepped forward. "Supervisor Carter," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the silence of the cafe. "We were beginning to wonder where you were." For the first time since the confrontation had started, the room erupted into a wave of confused whispers. Several customers lowered their phones slowly. The barista stared openly now. Officer Daniel Brooks turned around, the confidence on his face beginning to crack as the reality of the situation started to form in his mind. Angela Carter looked at the two agents, then calmly back at Brooks. And in that quiet moment, the entire balance of power inside the small cafe shifted without a single raised voice. The words hung in the air like a sudden change in weather. "Supervisor Carter." For a moment, the cafe felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had leaned closer to listen. Officer Daniel Brooks turned slowly toward the two men who had just entered, his earlier certainty fading into confusion that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. The taller of the two agents stepped forward first, his posture calm but unmistakably authoritative. He wore a dark suit, a simple tie, and the expression of someone who had already assessed the entire situation within seconds. His eyes moved briefly from Brooks to Angela and then back again. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. Angela Carter gave a small nod. "I am fine, Agent Morales," she said evenly. The second agent, a younger man with a tablet tucked under one arm, glanced at the crowd that had formed around the counter. Several customers were openly recording now. Others simply stared, their earlier curiosity turning into something closer to disbelief. Officer Brooks cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders, attempting to reclaim the authority he had been projecting minutes earlier. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. Agent Morales reached calmly into his jacket and presented a federal identification credential with practiced efficiency. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said. The words landed with quiet weight in the room. The barista's eyes widened. A customer near the window whispered something under his breath. Brooks stared at the credential for a second longer than necessary, his mind clearly trying to process what had just changed. Angela Carter remained still beside the counter, watching him with the same calm patience she had maintained from the beginning. Agent Morales continued in a steady voice. We were expecting Supervisor Carter at a briefing 20 minutes ago. Brooks blinked. Supervisor? Morales nodded once. Yes. The younger agent beside him glanced toward Angela with a respectful nod. She leads the task force scheduled to meet this morning. The silence in the cafe grew heavier again, but now it carried a different energy. It was no longer the tense quiet of a confrontation. It was the stunned quiet that follows a sudden realization. Brooks shifted his stance slightly. There must be some misunderstanding, he said quickly. Angela raised one eyebrow just slightly at the choice of words. Morales turned his attention back to Brooks. That depends on the details of what happened here. Brooks glanced briefly toward the phones pointed in his direction. The realization that the entire interaction might already be recorded seemed to settle over him like a weight. I was conducting a routine inquiry, he said carefully. Angela spoke for the first time since the agents entered. You detained a federal supervisor who was purchasing coffee before work, she said calmly. Her tone was not accusatory. It was factual, almost clinical, as if she were summarizing a line in a report. Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. Around them the cafe was no longer pretending to function normally. The line had completely stopped moving. Customers stood still, watching the exchange unfold. Even the low hum of conversation from earlier had disappeared. Agent Morales looked around the room once, taking in the phones, the witnesses, the tension that had already spread beyond the counter. Officer Brooks, he said calmly, why do not we step outside and discuss this properly? Brooks glanced again at Angela Carter, then at the growing number of people observing the scene. The balance of control he had assumed earlier was clearly gone. Angela picked up her purse and slipped her phone back inside. She turned toward the barista, who still looked stunned. I believe my latte was next, she said gently. The barista nodded almost automatically, as if waking from a trance. Yes, ma'am. Of course. As the espresso machine hissed back to life, Angela Carter turned slightly toward the door where sunlight spilled across the cafe floor. Agent Morales and his colleague waited quietly nearby, while Officer Brooks stood frozen between them and the counter, realizing that the ordinary moment he had tried to command only minutes earlier had just become something far larger than he ever imagined. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the center of the cafe floor, feeling something unfamiliar pressing against his confidence. Only minutes earlier he had walked into the room believing he controlled every step of the situation. Now the quiet weight of realization had begun to settle over him as the two federal agents remained calmly positioned beside the door and Supervisor Angela Carter waited patiently at the counter for a cup of coffee that had suddenly become the most unusual order of the morning. The espresso machine released a soft hiss while the barista carefully finished preparing the drink, her hands moving with cautious precision as if she understood that every sound in the room was now being noticed. Customers remained frozen in place, their attention shifting between Brooks, the agents, and Angela. A few phones were still held slightly above waist level recording everything. Brooks cleared his throat again, attempting to restore some measure of authority to his voice. Like I said, he began carefully. This was a routine inquiry. Agent Morales studied him quietly for a moment before speaking. Routine inquiries usually end when a person explains they are waiting in line for coffee, he replied calmly. The younger agent beside him opened the tablet he had been carrying and glanced briefly at the screen. Supervisor Carter's meeting began at 8:30 this morning, he said. We attempted to contact her when she did not arrive. Angela accepted the paper cup the barista handed to her and wrapped her fingers around it comfortably as if nothing unusual had happened at all. She lifted the cup slightly, taking a small sip before turning back toward the conversation unfolding beside her. Agent Morales, she said gently. I believe Officer Brooks was simply being thorough. Brooks looked at her with visible surprise, clearly unsure whether she was helping him or carefully documenting the moment. Morales gave a slight nod, but his eyes remained focused on the officer. Thorough is admirable, he said, when it is applied correctly. Outside the large front window, the dark sport utility vehicle remained parked along the curb. A second vehicle had now arrived quietly behind it. People passing along the sidewalk slowed their steps as they noticed the cluster of federal vehicles and the unusual number of people standing inside the cafe. Brooks noticed them too. The realization that the moment had already spread beyond the room made his posture stiffen slightly. Angela Carter turned her attention toward him again, her voice still calm, but carrying the steady clarity of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations in very simple terms. "Officer Brooks," she said, "when we first spoke, I asked you if you were certain you wanted to continue." Brooks shifted his stance. "Yes." Angela nodded once. "And you said you enforce the law here." Brooks hesitated. "That is correct." Angela took another small sip of coffee before lowering the cup. "The law," she said gently, "is very precise about the authority of law enforcement during a detention." Agent Morales watched Brooks carefully while the younger agent continued recording notes on the tablet. Around them, the café remained silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigeration units behind the counter. Brooks finally spoke again, though his voice now carried far less certainty than before. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Angela answered without raising her voice. "I am suggesting that what happened here will need to be reviewed." Morales nodded slightly. "That review has already begun." Brooks looked toward the phone still pointed in his direction, and then toward the agents standing calmly between him and the door. The ordinary morning he had expected when he walked into the café had clearly ended. Angela Carter placed the empty coffee lid back onto her cup and turned slightly toward the window where sunlight now reflected brightly across the street. "Officer Brooks," she said quietly, "every decision an officer makes has consequences. Some are small." She paused briefly before meeting his eyes again. "And some travel much farther than anyone expects." Officer Daniel Brooks felt the shift fully now. The quiet warning Angela Carter had given only minutes earlier had begun unfolding exactly the way she had suggested. Outside the cafe window, the two dark government vehicles remained parked along the curb, their presence attracting more curious glances from pedestrians who slowed as they walked past. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere had changed from tension to a careful kind of observation. People were no longer whispering. They were simply watching. Angela Carter stood calmly beside the counter holding her coffee cup, her posture relaxed as if she were waiting for the morning meeting she had originally planned to attend. Agent Morales remained near the entrance with the steady composure of someone used to arriving after situations had already begun spiraling in unexpected directions. The younger agent beside him continued recording details into the tablet with quiet efficiency. Officer Brooks shifted his stance again, glancing briefly toward the window where the federal vehicles were now clearly visible to anyone inside. "I believe this situation has been misunderstood," he said finally, his voice measured but noticeably less confident than before. Agent Morales studied him carefully before answering. "Then we will clarify it," he said calmly. Angela took another sip of her coffee and lowered the cup again, her attention returning to the officer who had stopped her minutes earlier. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "I understand that you believed you were doing your job." Brooks looked at her with an expression that was part relief and part confusion. "Exactly," he replied quickly. "That is all this was." Angela nodded once as if acknowledging the statement. "The problem," she continued quietly, "is that the law evaluates actions based on facts, not intentions." The words landed with quiet weight in the room. Several customers exchanged knowing glances. One of them lowered his phone slowly, but did not stop recording. Agent Morales folded his hands calmly in front of him. "Supervisor Carter leads a federal task force," he explained in an even tone. "Her team coordinates investigations involving multiple agencies, including local law enforcement." Brooks blinked as the implication of those words began forming in his mind. "You are saying this was some kind of official operation?" Angela shook her head slightly. "No," she answered calmly. "This was coffee." The simple sentence drew a quiet ripple of disbelief through the cafe. Angela continued before Brooks could respond. "However, the events that occurred during that coffee purchase will now become part of a documented review." The younger agent glanced up briefly from the tablet. "Several witnesses appear to have recorded the interaction," he said. Brooks looked again toward the customers who still held their phones. What had started as a small interaction inside a neighborhood cafe had now grown into something far more complicated than he had expected. Angela Carter turned slightly toward the front window again. Morning sunlight reflected across the glass and illuminated the federal vehicles outside with unmistakable clarity. A third vehicle had now pulled quietly to the curb behind the others. Agent Morales noticed it as well. "Internal Affairs will likely want a full account," he said calmly. Brooks inhaled slowly, his earlier confidence continuing to drain away as the scope of the situation expanded around him. Angela looked back at him with the same calm composure she had maintained from the beginning. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty about what was unfolding. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "earlier you mentioned enforcing the law." Brooks nodded slightly, unsure how to respond now. Angela lifted the coffee cup again, but paused before taking another sip. "Accountability," she continued softly, "is also part of that law." The words settled over the café like a final piece of a puzzle slowly falling into place. Outside the window, the morning traffic continued moving through downtown Baltimore exactly as it had before. But inside the small café on Market Street, everyone present understood that a routine moment had already transformed into something that would travel far beyond that quiet corner. The quiet statement about accountability lingered in the café long after Angela Carter spoke it. No one moved immediately. Even the small sounds that normally fill the morning coffee shop seemed to pause, as if the room itself understood that something important had just shifted. Officer Daniel Brooks looked around slowly, taking in the faces of the people who had witnessed the entire interaction from the moment he first stepped through the door. Only minutes earlier he had believed they were simply bystanders. Now they were something else entirely. Witnesses. The realization made his shoulders stiffen. Agent Morales remained calm near the entrance, observing everything with the steady patience of someone who had seen situations like this unfold before. The younger agent beside him finished entering the last notes into the tablet and quietly locked the screen. Outside the cafe window, the line of federal vehicles had grown to 3, their dark frames reflecting the bright morning sun that now filled Market Street. People walking along the sidewalk slowed openly now, looking through the glass with curiosity as they tried to understand why so many government vehicles had appeared outside a small neighborhood coffee shop. Inside, Angela Carter set her coffee cup gently on the counter and folded her hands together. Her posture remained composed, her voice steady when she spoke again. "Agent Morales," she said, "I believe Officer Brooks would like an opportunity to explain what happened here." Morales nodded slightly and turned his attention toward the officer. "That would be helpful," he said calmly. Brooks inhaled slowly, clearly aware that every word he chose now would matter far beyond the cafe walls. "I observed behavior that appeared unusual," he began carefully. "I asked for identification. That is standard procedure." Angela listened without interruption. When he finished, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering the explanation with genuine thought. "You believed I did not belong here," she said quietly. Brooks hesitated before answering. "I believe clarification was necessary." Angela nodded once, accepting the phrasing even though everyone in the room understood the meaning behind it. She glanced briefly at the customers who had been standing nearby throughout the interaction. Some lowered their phones slightly, but none left the cafe. Agent Morales spoke again in the same calm tone he had maintained since entering. "Officer Brooks, this interaction will be reviewed by the appropriate departments. The recordings that appear to exist will likely be included." Brooks followed his gaze toward the customers holding their phones. One of them, a middle-aged man near the window, raised his eyebrows slightly as if acknowledging the moment. The officer exhaled slowly. Angela picked up her coffee again and took a small sip before setting it back down. Her eyes returned to Brooks with quiet clarity. "You asked earlier who this would become complicated for," she said gently. Brooks said nothing. The answer was already forming around him. Angela continued, her voice soft but unmistakably firm. "When authority is used without understanding the person standing in front of you, the consequences can spread quickly." Agent Morales nodded slightly. "Situations like this often travel further than anyone expects." Outside the window, another pedestrian stopped briefly and pointed toward the line of vehicles before continuing down the sidewalk. Inside the cafe, the morning light continued to brighten the room, illuminating every detail that had turned an ordinary moment into something far larger. Brooks looked once more at Angela Carter, the woman he had stopped only minutes earlier while she waited in line for coffee. Now he understood something he had not considered when the interaction began. He had not simply confronted a customer in a cafe. He had stepped into a moment that would be replayed, reviewed, and discussed far beyond the quiet corner of Market Street. Angela Carter lifted her coffee cup once more, her expression calm as ever. "Officer Brooks," she said quietly, "every decision an officer makes becomes part of a record. Some records stay in a file. Others become lessons." The words settled over the room with a quiet finality that no one present could ignore. The word lessons lingered in the quiet air of the cafe long after Angela Carter finished speaking. For several seconds no one moved. The customers who had remained frozen in place since the confrontation began now understood they had witnessed something far bigger than a disagreement over identification in a coffee shop. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the center of the room with the uneasy awareness that the situation had moved beyond anything he could control. The calm authority he had relied on earlier had been replaced by something far more difficult to navigate: accountability. Outside the wide front windows, the morning sunlight now flooded Market Street, reflecting off the row of federal vehicles parked along the curb. Pedestrians slowed openly as they passed, pointing quietly toward the unusual gathering of government agents and curious onlookers inside the cafe. Inside the shop, the espresso machine hummed softly again, as if trying to restore the ordinary rhythm of the morning. But nothing about the moment felt ordinary anymore. Agent Morales remained near the door, his hands resting calmly in front of him while he observed the scene with professional patience. The younger agent beside him finished securing the tablet and slipped it under his arm. Angela Carter lifted her coffee cup again and took another small sip before placing it carefully back on the counter. Her expression remained composed, the same steady calm she had carried from the moment Officer Brooks first approached her in line. She turned her attention toward the window for a moment, watching the quiet movement of traffic outside, as if the city itself had continued its day without realizing how quickly a simple moment could expand into something far larger. Then she looked back at Brooks. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "you asked earlier who this situation would become complicated for." Brooks did not answer. His eyes moved briefly toward the phone still pointed in his direction, and then toward the federal agents standing calmly beside the entrance. Angela continued in the same steady voice. "When actions are recorded, reviewed, and shared, the story does not remain inside one room." Agent Morales nodded slightly. "The department will likely conduct a full internal review," he said. "That process is standard whenever questions about authority arise." Brooks swallowed slowly as the weight of those words settled in. A few customers near the window exchanged quiet glances with one another. One woman lowered her phone, but did not stop recording entirely. The room remained still except for the faint sounds of the street outside. Angela Carter folded her hands lightly around the warm coffee cup. "This morning began as a normal day for everyone here," she said calmly. "A coffee order, a conversation, a routine decision." She paused briefly before continuing. "But every routine decision carries responsibility." Brooks finally spoke again, though his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. "What happens now?" Angela did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the cafe at the people who had witnessed the entire exchange unfold from start to finish. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to disbelief, but one thing was clear. They had all seen the same moment, and many of them had recorded it. Angela turned back toward Brooks. "Now," she said quietly, "the process begins." Agent Morales stepped forward slightly, his tone calm, but unmistakably official. "Officer Brooks, your department will be notified. Statements will be collected from everyone involved." Outside the window, another government vehicle pulled slowly to the curb before stopping behind the others. The quiet line of dark vehicles reflected in the glass, like a reminder that the situation had already reached beyond the cafe walls. Angela Carter lifted her coffee cup once more and took a final sip. Then she looked at Brooks with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning. "Moments like this travel farther than anyone expects," she said softly. "Sometimes they reach offices, courtrooms, and city halls before the day is even finished." The room remained silent as those words settled into the morning air, and in that quiet space, everyone present understood that what had started as a brief encounter inside a neighborhood cafe had already begun moving outward into a much larger story. The quiet words about city halls and courtrooms lingered in the cafe like a slow echo of everything that had already unfolded. No one rushed to leave. The customers who had witnessed the entire exchange seemed to understand instinctively that the story was not finished yet. Outside on Market Street, the normal rhythm of the morning continued, but the presence of several federal vehicles along the curb had already begun drawing attention from passers-by. Some slowed their steps. Others paused briefly, trying to understand why agents in dark suits were gathered outside a small coffee shop that only minutes earlier had been just another stop for commuters. Inside the cafe, Angela Carter lifted her coffee again and finished the last sip. She placed the empty cup gently on the counter and turned toward Agent Morales. "We should not delay the briefing any longer," she said calmly. Morales nodded once. "The team is waiting." The younger agent stepped forward and opened the door, letting in a wave of cool morning air that carried the distant sounds of traffic and footsteps from the street. Before leaving, Angela Carter looked once more toward Officer Daniel Brooks. He stood exactly where he had been, the weight of the situation clearly settling across his expression as the reality of the moment expanded beyond the cafe walls. Angela did not look angry. She did not look satisfied. Instead, her expression carried something quieter, something closer to reflection. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "this morning will be written down in several reports before the day ends." Brooks did not answer immediately. He understood now that the witnesses, the recordings, and the presence of federal agents meant the event would not remain a private misunderstanding inside a coffee shop. Angela continued in the same steady voice. "Every officer carries responsibility with the authority of the badge. That responsibility follows every decision." Agent Morales waited patiently beside the door while the younger agent glanced once more toward the customers who had remained silent observers throughout the entire interaction. Some of them lowered their phones slowly now, though a few continued recording until the very last moment. Angela Carter stepped toward the door and paused briefly in the sunlight spilling through the glass. Outside, the line of federal vehicles stood quietly along the curb, their dark surfaces reflecting the bright sky above downtown Baltimore. She turned back once more, her voice calm and clear. "Sometimes the most important part of justice is not punishment," she said softly. "It is the reminder that every person deserves to be seen before they are judged." The words settled across the room like a final note in a long conversation. Agent Morales gave Brooks a brief professional nod before stepping outside behind Angela. The door closed quietly after them, leaving the cafe filled with a silence that felt very different from the one that had existed earlier that morning. Slowly, the ordinary sounds of the shop returned. The espresso machine hissed again. Customers began speaking in low voices as they processed what they had witnessed. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing for several seconds longer, staring toward the door where Angela Carter had exited into the sunlight. Outside on Market Street, the federal vehicles pulled away one by one, merging back into the steady flow of the city. But inside the cafe, and soon across the departments and offices that would review the recordings and reports, the lesson of that morning would continue traveling far beyond that quiet corner where a single decision had changed everything.